There was the last normal day, the last day that things were the way they were before they weren't anymore.
We kind of all rushed out of the house and said a quick goodbye. And, little did I know that would be the last time I hugged my mom.
He yells and tells me he's getting ready to go. He said, I'm okay. Just stay here. I'll be home in a few hours. We tell him bye and he leaves. That was the last time we ever saw him.
It's like the minute that helicopter hit the air, it just hit me what I was watching, because I knew he wasn't coming home and he knew he wasn't coming home.
For me, I took it more personally because I'm a nurse practitioner, and why can't I save him? I can help all these other people, and why can't I save him?
They're telling us that it was time, we needed to make a decision, we need to go ahead and just take him off the ventilator. And I was like, how do we know?
One thing I like to tell people is that if you lose somebody to COVID, your need to talk about the person you lost will outlast other people's desire to hear about it.
We make sure that our family members and loved ones' memories lived on. That's really important to me, is that people don't forget. I don't want to forget any of it.
So talk about them. Talk about them till people are sick of hearing about them. Because as long as you're still talking about them, they're never far away.
And the last thing that my mom said is, she said, when you get to heaven, we will look for each other.
Hello everyone, you're listening to For Those We Lost. I'm your host, Jennifer Sullivan. Thank you for being here. Today I'll be talking to Christina in California. Christina lost her dad, Raul, her brother, Raul Jr., and her sister, Margie, all to COVID in January 2021. Christina was a nurse at the hospital where her family was, and so she was able to see her family members and check in on them at a time when most family was not allowed in the hospitals. She recognizes the blessing this was, but also talks about the things that haunt her. Christina shares about the many memorials in the COVID community she's participated in, and I've linked to many of them in the show notes below. For context, we recorded this episode on February 4th, 2023. Finally, there is a metallic sound you can hear near the beginning of the show, just as an FYI. And throughout this episode, Christina does talk about detailed medical procedures. This may be triggering for some. And with that, I'd like to welcome Christina to the show today. Thank you for being here.
Hi, Jennifer. Thank you for having me and letting me tell my story.
Yeah, today we are talking about three of your family members, your father, your only sister, and one of your brothers who all passed away in January of 2021.
Yes.
Yes. Ugh. And you worked at the hospital where they were.
Correct. I'm a nurse and I worked there. I was there for about 16 years.
Yeah. Well, I want to jump right in so that you have time to just talk about them and tell their story and take as much time as you need. Where I like to start is to go back to March of 2020 and talk about how you first heard about COVID and the changes in your family. What did you have to do differently? How did it affect your work, your parents, your brothers and sisters, all those people?
In 2020, well, like I said, I'm a nurse and I was working at the hospital, so I would hear little bits of it on the news about China. And then, the next thing was, there were cases in the States, and then cases in California. And then, then it just kind of went from there, cases in nearby counties. And then finally, my county, which is San Luis Obispo County, had their first case. And everything kind of just snowballed. Working at the hospital, they were, issuing, we had to wear masks. The guidelines were changing literally day to day. We did experience, the shortage in masks and PPE. So that was kind of my first interaction with COVID. It was kind of almost like a stigma, and it's like, it was like, hush, hush, so-and-so had his COVID. And I worked on postpartum unit, and we were getting a lot of moms that were testing positive for COVID, but they were asymptomatic. So they didn't even know that they had COVID because they didn't have any symptoms. And so, everything shut down mid-March. But, being a nurse, still had to go to work and everything. And that was kind of my first, how things were for me when COVID first hit. Working at the hospital, I knew that there was a possibility of me getting COVID. So I stayed away from my family because I didn't want to expose any of them. They all had health concerns. My mom was diabetic, my brother's diabetic, my dad had a valve replacement years back, and he was on blood thinners, things like that. My other brother, he had asthma and, chronic bronchitis, things like that. So I stayed away because I didn't want to expose them. And my mom, being the person that she is, she started stocking up. So she had, Lysol spray and Clorox wipes, and she had gloves, she had, masks, things like that. So she, would tell us, she's like, well, we're ready. I'm ready. If you guys need anything, if you need masks, if you need, this and that. And then I got COVID in July of 2020. And, the first week I was like, okay, I can handle this. I'm good. And then on day 7, it just kind of hit me like a truck. And it took me like 4.5 weeks to recover. Wow. And then another, I think, additional 2 weeks before I was testing negative. And so it was funny because I had tested so that I could go and see visit my family. And I didn't get those results until I had already had COVID, telling me that I did not have COVID. So, but, I went back to work, and COVID was just even more scarier now because I definitely didn't want to experience that again. And we were seeing more and more COVID patients on our unit, still a lot asymptomatic. I, charge nurse, and I would go to bed meetings, and they would talk about, how many COVID patients they had in the CCU on ventilators. At that point, they had kind of 3 different ICUs going, and majority of them were COVID patients on ventilators. And then, talk about the vaccine started, going around and everything. And people were like, oh no, I'm not going to get vaccinated. That came out too fast. And the healthcare workers were going to be the first group, first responders, things like that, to get the vaccine. And I kind of went back and forth about it. And, I'm pro-vaccine. And so I decided to go ahead and get it. And I was the first group at my hospital that would have the opportunity to get the vaccine. So I had decided, I even sent a group text to my family to let them know that I had decided to get the vaccine. And so they were okay with it, and stuff. And so on December 18th, I got my first vaccine, and I sent a picture with my vaccination card to my family to let them know I did it. I'm like, hey, I did it. And that's when I found out from my brother, his name's Raul, was sick. And so, right away, being a nurse, being a sister, I'm like, well, what are your symptoms? And he told me that he had a cough, had congestion, the body aches, the GI, stuff. He was chronic bronchitis, he was diabetic. He said that he had tested for COVID and was waiting for his results. And then I think it was later that day, or maybe even the next day, he texted back and said that he tested positive for COVID. And knowing what I had gone through, I'd gone through like 2 rounds of steroids and inhaler, everything. And I'm like, okay, I said, I have an inhaler. I have, asking him what his symptoms were again. And I told him, I said, you need to call your doctor and ask them to prescribe you an inhaler, some prednisone, things like that. And he's like, well, I'm, in between insurances, because he had just started a new job. And I said, well, you can go to the ER, you can go, and he's like, well, he goes, if I get worse, I can do, like a telehealth appointment. And, and I remember telling him, and I said, don't wait until you get worse. You need to be proactive, not reactive. And then a few days later, on the 22nd of December, my mom texted me to tell me that my brother had a rough night. He was struggling a lot, and she was telling me what his oxygen saturation was. And I told her, I said, you need to take him to the emergency room. And she's like, well, what about a breathing treatment? And I'm like, do you have one? And she's like, no, but your brother, which is my other brother, said he could bring one. And I said, Mom, I said, he needs to go now. You need to take him to the emergency room. So she took him to the local ER, which for us is Aurora Grande Hospital. And they were he was in the ER, and at that time, you couldn't be in there with them. They would just, take your person and say, okay, we'll call you later.
Yeah.
And so my mom texted me, and I called my brother and talked to him on the phone and asked him again what his symptoms were, are you on oxygen, things like that. And I asked him if it was okay if I called the nurse's station to talk to his nurse. And he said yes. So I said, okay, and I hung up with them, and I called the ER to talk to his nurse. And then So at that time, the ER doctor actually got on the phone and told me that they were having a hard time getting his oxygen saturation up. He's on high flow oxygen right now. The CCU doctor at Marion Hospital told them that if they can't keep his oxygen level up, that they were going to have to intubate him. And she was like, he looks perfectly fine. He's doing well on the oxygen, the high flow, and he's just sitting there and he looks comfortable. And so then she put me on hold, and I guess the intensivist from Marion Hospital had called back, and because they were going to be transferring him to Marion Hospital because Aurora Grande Hospital wasn't treating COVID patients at that time. And they said that they wanted him to be intubated before they transfer him. So she allowed me to call my brother to talk to him about it and everything, because she was going to go in there and talk to him and stuff. So I called him back and everything, and I, told them, I said, they want to intubate you, put you on a ventilator before they transfer you. And so at that time, the doctor had come in and talked to him and stuff, and I was on the phone with him listening. And, I told him, I said, you have to let them do whatever they need to do to get you better. And that it was better for them to do it now instead of in an emergent case. So he consented, and I told him I loved him. I told him, don't be scared. You need to keep fighting. They're going to get you better. And I asked him if he wanted me to call his son, because his son lives in Michigan. And he said yes. So I told him I loved him. I hung up with him, and I called my nephew. I had to leave a message, and I told him, I said, I really need you to call your dad. It's an emergency. And then about 20 minutes later, my nephew called me back, and I asked him if he had spoke to his dad, and he said no. So I'm guessing that they intubated him pretty quickly. And so I told my nephew what was going on with his dad and stuff, and that was about 3 days after he tested positive. He got his results. I had asked him where he thought he got it from, and he said that he thought that he maybe got it when he was out Christmas shopping. They were being very careful. Like, they didn't go anywhere unless they had to, unless it was to work or groceries. And, it was Christmas time. So he went out to do some Christmas shopping. Very careful, wore his masks and everything. And then my mom, I think it was before my brother went to the hospital, my mom told me that she wasn't feeling well. Like, she just kind of felt like her throat was scratching. She just, her nose was a little congested, and she just thought that maybe it was from the cleaning, breathing in like the cleaning products, because she was doing her best to like make sure everything was clean, wipe down everything. If my brother used the restroom, she went in there after and wiped everything down. So that's when I had found out that she hadn't been feeling well anymore, because I called to check on her. So that my dad was kind of not feeling so great. And then I found out that my youngest brother tested positive for COVID. And he isolated, like he stayed a few days in a hotel, and he has 2 small children that he had happened to send home with their mom, I think just shortly before they started to get sick. So now we're into the week of Christmas.
Yeah.
And my mom went, I think it was on Christmas Eve, to get tested. And she made my dad go and get tested, even though he wasn't having, really any symptoms. I found out later that on the 23rd is when my sister started not feeling well. And she had been going to work prior to that. And I'm like, why are you going to work? You should be isolating because you're in a home with somebody that has COVID. And she's like, no, my job said if I don't have symptoms, I can come to work. And I was like, wow. I said, a coworker at the hospital, somebody in her house tested positive and she's out for 2 weeks. So then my parents went and got tested. And then I think a day later, my sister went and got tested. On the day after Christmas, my mom and dad said that they both tested positive for COVID. And I think the day after that, my sister got her results and she also had COVID. My niece, which is my sister's daughter, had started getting sick. But by that time, my sister was so sick that she couldn't even take her to go get tested. So we're pretty sure she had COVID as well.
Mm-hmm.
She's high risk because she has valley fever. So she's on high doses of antifungals, which can suppress the immune system. And that's how Christmas went. I didn't get to see any of them for Christmas. I put their gifts in a bag and left it on their doorstep on Christmas Eve. That week was a hard week. My brother was unstable. His blood sugars were through the roof. They told me that he was in bad shape when he got there to the hospital. Working at the hospital, I was able to go into the CCU and see him. My mom had made me his person of contact. So I was able to call the hospital to get updates, which I did. I called every morning. If I worked, I would try and go and see him. I called every evening, so that I could turn around and tell my family, my siblings and my mom, updates. At one point, so a few days after being on the ventilator, they extubated him. They took him off the ventilator. They said that it may not always be successful. That the nurse had said that, what did she say? She said something that they kept telling us baby steps, baby steps. So I got to see him after they extubated him. He was not really conscious. He would open his eyes now and then, and he wasn't really responsive to touch, if when I talked to him or anything. And he was very confused, and he would kind of start waving his arms around, and and they had to put restraints on him so he wouldn't pull out his his IVs and things like that. I called my mom, I video chatted my mom so she could see him, and she talked to him, and for a brief moment he opened his eyes and he said, "Mama."
Oh.
And, we were so excited, that he recognized my mom's voice and everything. And the next morning, when I called for the update, they told me that he had to be intubated again, that his bouts of agitation would cause his oxygen levels to decrease. They had to put him back on the ventilator and stuff. And during those times, they did talk about he was still responsive. They would decrease his sedation just enough to check responsiveness, and he was still responsive. But then he started spiking fevers, and he was to the point where they said he was septic, and his blood pressures were too low, so they had him on blood pressure medicine to bring it up. His blood sugars were too high. They had him on an insulin drip to bring his sugars down. His kidney function levels were starting to go up, which meant that he was having issues with his kidneys. The doctor, he's in bad shape. And he had recommended that we make him a DNR, a do not resuscitate, if his heart stopped, because he said that if they had to do life-saving measures, that it would do more harm than good. So I had to talk to my mom and tell her what the doctor said and let her know that he asked if we wanted to make him a do not resuscitate if his heart stopped. And ultimately that was my mom, it was what my mom thought, in that point, my mom needed to make that decision. Yeah. So she did. So we made him a do not resuscitate if his heart stopped. And then New Year's rolled around. His fevers had gotten better, and but they were starting to say that he wasn't as responsive, and that his kidneys were failing. He was going into kidney failure, and talked about dialysis. And then on the 30th of December, my mom texted me, I believe, to tell me that my dad was having a hard time breathing, that she was worried about him. His oxygen levels were like 86, 88. So I told her I would take him to the emergency room. And, I had an N95, I had goggles, I had gloves. I went and I picked up my dad, and I took him to the emergency room. And, on the way there, we were talking, and he was very emotional, and he just would, because my sister had moved back home. Her and her relationship, they had separated, so she went back to my mom and dad's so she could save some money to get a place of her own. And my dad was emotional, and he said that if he hadn't let her come back home, then she wouldn't be sick. Oh. And I told him, I said, Dad, I said, she could have gotten sick anywhere. It's just, rotten luck. And so I took him to the emergency room. And again, they couldn't have family with them. So when they triaged him, his oxygen saturation was 88. They did take him back, and they told me, go home, they'll call me. And in my head, I'm like, no, I'm not going home. Yeah. So I went and sat in my car, and I called my mom just to let her know. And I guess she'd been texting with my dad. And then, I don't know, maybe an hour later, my dad came out to the car, and he told me that they said my oxygen levels were fine. I guess while he was sitting there, they went back up to like 93. So they sent him home. And on New Year's Day, my mom texted me to tell me that my dad was having a really hard time breathing. And I didn't know what to do. I didn't know what to tell her because we had taken him to the ER and they sent him home. And I was literally like, my heart was clenching because I didn't know what to do. I didn't know what to tell her. And his oxygen saturations were like 88, 86. And I said, okay, I said, if they get below 85, he needs to go to the hospital. So then a little bit later, she called me to tell me that my brother was going to take him to the hospital. And I asked him, I said, well, can you check on Margie and see how she's doing? Because if she needs to go too, they should go together. And so my mom went to my sister and to check her oxygen saturation, and it was like 90, I think. And then I told my mom, I said, have her take some deep breaths and cough. And she did. And my mom's like, well, it went up to like 90, 92. And I said, maybe she should just go with dad and get checked. And I could hear my sister says, I'm not going to the hospital. So my sister being stubborn, and I told my mom, I said, I guess, have Matt take dad. And then I found out like later that night that my brother ended up taking my sister to the hospital as well. And the next morning when I talked to my brother's nurse, which happened to be a friend of his that they went to high school together. And, so she was giving me an update on him, and I asked her, I said, any chance you know about my dad? And she said that they had, he's in the ER, they intubated him, and they were waiting to bring him up. But she said she would go down to the ER just to double check. So then she called me again and said, no, he's not intubated. They're waiting to transfer him to CCU. And so I went to work that weekend, and I went to the CCU to check on my brother, and my dad was there. And so the doctor was kind of giving me updates on them, and that I found out that my dad told them that before they intubated him, that he said he didn't want to be on the ventilator for very long. And that devastated me. That devastated my mom because they hadn't talked about it. My mom didn't know until after the fact. And so my brother was still in not great shape at that point, and my dad was ventilated. So I went to go see my sister, and she was on the telemetry unit on high flow oxygen. So, I went to her room, and, it's all the seal on the door and, and everything. And so I went in to see her, and the nurse was in there doing some things, and I was standing off to the side, and my sister looked at me, and she flipped me off, which is something that she would do, and so then the nurse left, and I talked to her for a little bit. I brought her a phone charger because she didn't grab hers. I gave her an update on my dad and my brother, and she started crying. So I hugged her. I went up to her and I hugged her. And that had been the last face-to-face conversation I had had with my sister. At this point, my brother had no idea that any of the family had gotten COVID. And he never knew that my dad and my sister passed away from COVID. My dad never knew that, and my sister, she never knew. They never were getting any kind of consciousness. And so the next morning, it was around a little bit before 7:30, on the 4th of January, I got a call from my sister's nurse telling me that my sister wasn't doing so good, that they were going to be transferring her to the CCU and that they were going to ventilate her. So she said, so now's the time if you want to talk to her. So I started calling her. She didn't answer her phone. And I'm like texting her. I'm like, sister, please answer your phone. I need to talk to you. Please. And she's like texting me. She's like, I can't talk, because by that time she was on BiPAP. And she's like, I can't talk. I have this machine, on my face. And I said, FaceTime me. I just want to see you. I need to see you. And then, so I'm trying to FaceTime her and she's trying to FaceTime me, and it just wouldn't go through. It's like when you're calling the same person, and it just kind of, I kept texting. I'm like, please answer, please, FaceTime me. I need to see you. I need to talk to you. And then finally, I just was like, I texted her and I said, sister, I love you. Don't be scared. Let them do what they need to do to get you better. And I'm just like, keep fighting, keep breathing. I love you. And I never knew if she got that message. I don't know. I think it was months later. I had asked my niece, because she had her mom's phone. And she told me that she didn't get that message because it hadn't been read yet. And so those text messages trying to connect with my sister was the last interaction I had with her. And so now I had 3 people in the CCU on ventilators with COVID. And I took a leave of absence from work.
Yeah.
And having been there for so long as a nurse, a lot of the leadership in the hospital had been people that I had interacted with. And at some point, the chief nursing officer used to be my director. The director who was kind of in charge with some of the COVID stuff was a coworker of mine from my unit. A couple of the assistant nurse managers in the CCU were people that I went to nursing school with, and things like that. So I was able to have privileges that I know probably nobody else had. So it just kind of started this daily ritual. My mind went into nurse mode, and I called every morning, got updates on my brother, on my dad, on my sister, how is their blood pressure? How's their blood sugar? How's their urine output? Is he still are they still on steroids? Are they still on antibiotics? How much oxygen are they on? What's their level? What are their settings? My brother and my sister were in kidney failure, so they were started on dialysis. My brother was still the sickest, and they kept telling us that, almost reminding us that, my dad didn't want to be on the ventilator for long, but didn't specify how long. And since he wasn't getting worse, my mom, she just was like, no, I'm not ready. And so 9 days later, they approached us again. And this was the assistant nurse manager. she wanted to talk, which her name was Katie. She's one of my classmates from nursing school. My friend Robin, who was one of the directors, she came with me and we sat down, and they told me that, it's time. The doctor said my dad's been here on the ventilator for 9 days. He hasn't gotten better, and there had not been any improvements. And he's like, he's not getting better, he's not getting worse, but his wishes were to not be on a ventilator long. So they talked to me a little bit more, and I asked them if they would talk to my mom, because I didn't know how to tell my mom that it was time to let my dad go. So I called my mom and I said, Mom, can you come down? They want to talk to you about dad. And she asked me, she goes, do I need to get your brothers? And I said, yeah, I think that would be good. So we met my mom outside. We sat down, and they told my mom that, it was my dad's wishes that he not be on a ventilator for very long, and that right now he's just treading water, and then eventually his body's going to get tired.
Mm-hmm.
And that he had made that decision for us because he didn't want us to have to make that decision. So my mom can talk to us about it, and she consented to withdraw care for my dad. And, again, having the relationships in the hospital that I had, my mom and I were able to be there with my dad when he passed away. The proning and everything prior to that, they had left him longer on his stomach, because every time they moved him, his oxygen levels decreased. But because of that, the straps and the ventilator, the intubation tubes and everything cut into his face. So he just looked like he just had all this road rash on his face. And after they took him off the ventilator and everything, he didn't look like my dad anymore. He just had all these scabs on his face. And we played music for him, and we talked to him. And so my mom had to hold his hand as he passed away. And I didn't know what to do for my mom. And so I just kind of sat there and waited for her. One of the night nurse assistant managers I had gone to nursing school with as well. And she told me that before they intubated him, that she had met my dad because she was on shift. And she told him that she knew me and that I was a good nurse. And he just smiled. He said, yeah, she is. And then to take my mom home, my brothers were waiting. They got to say goodbye to my dad through the phone. And that was kind of it for my dad. I think it was 3 a.m. the next day that he passed away. So, we started, letting people know about my dad passing away. And my dad had a couple really good friends. I told my mom I would give them a call if she would just send me the number. So I was sitting at home just kind of numb. And, I had this ringtone for my dad when he would text me, and it was Darth Vader's, like, Luke, I'm your father. And so, I'm sitting there and that tone comes on my phone and my heart's like stopped, and stuff. And it turned out that my mom had sent me the contacts from my dad's friend, but she sent it to me from my dad's phone.
Oh, wow.
And so I kind of had to, nurse mode back up. And because my brother and my sister were still in the hospital. So, and the hospital, they were so great. They worked so hard, that having 3 family members in there, they were so great to me. And, there were, at that time, they needed extra help, turning patients, checking blood sugars, things like that. And so a lot of people from other departments were floating to the ICUs to help out. And I had gotten a call from one of my coworkers. She's a labor and delivery nurse, and told me that she had floated and had went in and talked to my dad, and she prayed for him and everything. And she's like, I just sat there with him. And to have all those familiar faces and people showing, the amount of care and stuff, and kind of taking care of me and being there for me, it meant a lot. And so a couple days later, on the 13th, there was a new ICU doctor. I hadn't met him, and I went to go see my sister. And because prior to that, the ICU doctor had said, we're having a hard time keeping your sister's oxygen levels up. There's only so many things we can do. He said, intubation's one. He said paralytics are two, to help. So she lets the machine do the work instead of her body. And he said, and 3, pronate. And he said, and once all of those have been done and the oxygen levels are maxed out, he goes, there isn't anything else we can do. Mm-hmm. And so they had started proning my sister. And she was very swollen. They had started her on dialysis. And the CCU doctor, the new one, he was just basically, he wanted to see me when I came in. And he just was very blunt. He's like, your sister's not doing well. And he, basically said, you should consider comfort care. And I was just kind of like, what? And then I had asked, I said, well, can you tell me how my brother's doing? And he's like, well, who's your brother? And I told him, and he goes, oh, he's like, he's improving, and he said, I don't want to, jinx it, but he goes, I think he might pull out of this. And so, there was hope, I remember thinking, how are we going to tell him that dad passed away from COVID, that knowing that he had brought COVID into the house.
Yeah.
So still liked with that. And then what the doctor said about my sister, I had talked to my mom about it. And then I had reached out to my friend who was a director. She was there with me when they talked to us about my dad. She was there waiting with us until my dad passed away. I called her and asked her if she would come tomorrow, the next day, to talk with the doctor, because I want to know and understand what he is saying. And so we sat down in his office, and I put my mom on the phone, And he basically said that my sister was very sick, that he said she has about 40 liters of extra fluid on her body. Her kidneys are failing, that they can do things to help, but when they try to fix something, it would cause another problem. So he's like, we can increase the dialysis, but then that causes to pull off more fluid, but then it causes her blood pressure to go down. And he's like, she's on the maximum amount of oxygen that we can give her, that's basically able to be given. And he said that she's going to end up going into cardiac arrest. And he goes, and we can try life-saving measures, but in the end, she will not survive. So we talked to my brothers and talked to my niece, and I told my niece what the doctors said, and she started crying. And I told her, I called her Lovey. I always call her Lovey. I said, Lovey, I said, your mom is suffering, and we don't want her to suffer. So she consented to withdraw care on my sister. And so my mom and my niece, my brothers came down, and they allowed my mom and my niece and myself to be there with my sister. And it wasn't until then, when they took her off the ventilator. I mean, she wasn't even off all the way, and you could tell she was passing away. So when they took her off, the tube came out. She passed away within minutes. And I remember coming home and a friend of mine calling me, and I told her about my sister, and I just sobbed. I just sobbed. My sister and I were 11 months apart, and for 12 days in July we were the same age.
Oh.
And we grew up together. She was my best friend, and so we were down 2 family members, and I had to go back to nurse mode. At this time, my brother was, his eyes were open, and I consented for them to do a tracheostomy, and so they did that. His oxygen support was decreasing. He was breathing on his own and so the ventilator was doing very little work. His blood sugars had stabilized. His blood pressure stabilized, so he wasn't on blood pressure medicine. His insulin was just, like twice a day. And he was still on dialysis because his kidneys were still having issues. He started to develop like some lung infections, I guess, that are common for people that are on ventilators. But his eyes, they were just kind of like moving back and forth, almost like he was looking around. But he wasn't responsive. He wasn't like, if you talked to him, he didn't look at you. He wasn't moving his arms or his legs. And so, but like there would be little things, like one of the nurses said that when she was cleaning him up, like he like kind of moaned, and another time like she was trying to clean his face, and she said he like pulled away, and I never saw any of that. And the doctor started to wonder why he wasn't moving any of his extremities. He hadn't been on, they had withdrawn all the sedation. He'd been off of it for days. And so they ended up doing a MRI. And that was on the Friday, the 22nd of January. And they told me that it looked like he had some areas of anoxia, which is, lack of oxygen to both sides of his brain. And the ICU doctor told me that, it wasn't a great scan. So they were going to repeat it and have the neurologist read it on Monday when he came in. So they did the MRI on Saturday, the 23rd. And I noticed that when he came back from that, like his breathing was labored and everything, and he was requiring oxygen, ventilator support, more ventilator support. His vital signs were going down. He just, almost like it just took a lot out of him. And I saw all that, and then little by little, they said that his blood sugars were starting to go back up. They said his blood pressures were starting to drop, so they had to put him back on medication to keep his blood pressures up. They said he had a fever, and they said that he probably had another lung infection. And on the 25th, which was that Monday, the neurologist had read it, the scan, the MRI, and I had called, and he was there, and I talked to him on the phone, and he said that there is anoxia, lack of oxygen, there's damage to his brain on both sides, and that there was even more that he noted that the radiologist missed. And he said that I asked him, I was asking him questions. I said, so what does that mean? What? And he's like, well, he goes, some people can recover, but because the damage has already been done, it's permanent. And so they could seem healthy and, but that damage is still there. That doesn't heal. And so when I went in to see my brother, I had stopped to talk to my mom to tell her. And she just she started sobbing, and she's like, no. And I told her I was going to go talk to the doctor, and that I would, let her know. And I talked to the doctor, and they were so sweet. They were, I feel like they were kind of tiptoeing around the issue and, trying to be hopeful, trying to give us hope, because we were hopeful. We thought, he's awake. He's going to come home.
Yeah.
And I had finally asked the doctor, I said, if he gets better, the lung infection, getting off the, ventilator, the dialysis, everything, if he got better, what are we looking at? I said, I don't want to be causing him more harm than good. And he finally said that he wouldn't even be 50% of who he was. And I knew at that point that it was time. So I called my mom again and told her
and my brothers were there, so it was on speakerphone. I called my nephew in Michigan to let him know. He had, so that Friday prior, the 22nd of January, was when we buried my dad and my sister. And he had been here for the funeral of my nephew. And they let me bring him in so he could see his dad that day. And then he flew out. He went home after the services with my dad and my sister. And so I had to call him to tell him what they said and everything, and that it was time to let him go because we knew that he didn't want to live a life where he wasn't himself. He was already starting to get some pressure sores just because of like the diarrhea, and was breaking down his skin. And he would be mad if I just told people right now that he had diarrhea. He was requiring more oxygen support and everything. And so the 25th of January, that was the day. And we decided that we would wait and do it the next day because January 25th is my niece's birthday. And we didn't want that. We didn't want her to remember that on her birthday.
Yeah.
So the next day, my mom, myself, they allowed my brothers to be there, but my youngest brother, he's like, I can't do that. I can't be there. I can't see that. So my other brother, David, went, and my mom, when she walked in, she could see, she knew that he was working so hard, that he was getting worse. And so they extubated him and everything, and we sat with him and called people so they could say goodbye. We called his ex-wife in Michigan, and she said goodbye. And my kids, he said goodbye. You and my ex-husband, he said goodbye. And for the third time, we sat there and waited till he passed away. And he never regained consciousness. And my mom sat there while her second child passed away. You know, my brother, he started crying, and it was just numbing for me. At this point, you know, I had a lot of support there at the hospital, like my friend Robin, who had been there with us all 3 times. My friend Katie had been there with us. The wife of the chief of staff, the physicians, she was there. She was a friend of mine too. And there was just so many people there. People had been praying for us. And it was definitely the hardest thing to ever do. You know, my dad, my mom and dad got married when they were 17 and 18. And this year, actually this month, they would have celebrated their 50th wedding anniversary. And no, actually, last year, they would have celebrated their 50th wedding anniversary. And he just was a good man, and he loved us, and he was there for us. We counted him. I miss him. You know, when my car's running weird and I want to call him and be like, Dad, this is what, you know, my car's doing. And he's not there to ask anymore, or Dad, I have to, do something. Can you give me a ride? Um, he was always there. And my sister, she had the best laugh. She just always had this boisterous laugh. She was very social, and people liked her. Her coworkers, they liked her. Uh, she had a lot of friends, and she loved my niece so much that she was, even though my niece was an adult, that was her baby. That was her pride and joy.
Yeah.
And my brother, he was so funny. He was made fun of us, teased us, and he had finally found something that he was passionate about. He was doing competition barbecuing professionally, and
Wow.
he was doing really well. And around the time of his death, he was ranked 11th or 17th in the state of California. And I think his death hit the hardest because we had hope. We had hope that because he was coming home. So 2 days before my mom and dad's anniversary, we buried him. And at that time, there was a little bit more leniency with services and stuff. But they were still wanting social distancing, no gathering, things like that. But we were able to have a viewing in the mortuary. And my sister was cremated and my dad was buried. So before they closed my dad's casket, they put my sister's urn inside with him. And we had a rosary and a service at the gravesite. And there were so many people there. Friends of my dad's, friends of my sister's, even friends of my brothers were there. And then that was in January. And then in February is when we buried my brother. And after that, it just seemed so final.
Yeah.
The last thing to be done was we ordered the grave cemetery marker. And they only allow 2 markers per plot. So we were, in essence, burying 3 family members there, which meant that we had to figure out how we would be able to do 1 marker so that my mom would also be able to be buried with my dad. And so we ended up with a family plot, a family marker with our last name. And then my dad, my sister, my brother on there, and then a spot for my mom. And it was kind of a cool process because my family were avid Raider fans. And so next to my dad's name, there's a Raider emblem. Next to my brother's name is his logo for his barbecue team. Next to my mom's, there's a cross with a rosary. And then for my sister, she loved butterflies. So next to her name, there are butterflies. And it allows for 1 more marker so that my niece, when her time comes, will be able to be buried with her mom.
Mm-hmm.
And so when that came in, that was just kind of the absolute the finality of it. And it was hard. You count down like every month, you're like, oh, it's the 10th. Oh, it's the 13th. Oh, it's the 26th. 6 months, a year, it's still like the 10th, the 13th, the 26th. Those are days that I won't ever forget. And seeing everything that I saw in the hospital, the day-to-day things that my mom didn't see or my brothers didn't see, it haunts me. It haunts me a lot. And for a long time, I battled with, did I ask all the right questions? Should I have done this? Should I have pushed for this? Should I have, what if?
Mm-hmm.
I felt a lot of guilt because, kind of growing up, I was a middle child for a while. I kind of took on the role as a caregiver. It's why I became a nurse, so that I was able to be there and help take care of them. So I kind of felt like I failed. That was hard for me because definitely that's something I'm used to feeling. And I started going to counseling right away. The recommendation of one of my friends, this one, I was seeing her for a while, for a little bit. And then I found out that there was a counselor that the hospital hired to work with employees with everything that they were seeing and going through.
Mm-hmm.
So I got connected with him, and it was good to talk to him because it helped me understand some things about myself. It helped me work through my guilt. And then about a little over a year ago, I kind of got to a point where I just couldn't. It was too traumatizing to be there at the hospital. Every time I walked in, I was, I was reminded of everything. My support system at work was great. I mean, it was just great. I think the only thing that for us that we were disappointed in was the spiritual care. It was, so we're Catholic, and the night that we withdrew care for my dad, my mom wanted his, I can't think of what they're called, but his last rites. It's called something else, but I can't remember. So they sent a chaplain who couldn't even gown up and go in there and and give my dad his last rites because she had cancer and her immune system was low. And it was just it was disappointing to my mom that she kind of was like, well, why would they send somebody with that health status to a place where COVID is everywhere?
Yeah.
And then for my sister, it was kind of the same thing. It was a different chaplain, but the Catholic priest on the phone gave my sister her last rites by phone. So it just, the pastoral care, spiritual care wasn't, my mom was disappointed because she, that's her faith, and she just kind of felt like the support could have been better. And we just kind of had to figure out how to live without them. Like COVID wiped out half of my family in a span of 2 weeks. And I tried to encourage my mom to get counseling, but she wasn't ready. And she was so just devastated by the loss of my dad, her husband, um, that she hadn't processed yet the fact that she also lost her firstborn child, and her firstborn son. And now that she's starting to process it, the grief has just really taken a toll on her health, on her well-being, as she's trying to work through it.
Yeah. So that's what you meant when you said you were used to being a middle child. You are the oldest now.
Yes. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. And you started to mention about a year ago working at the hospital. Did you make a shift and start working somewhere else?
No, actually, because a couple times during the week I was a charge nurse for our unit. So I wasn't, I was in the float pool, and it was voluntary. And so I hadn't made it there yet when everything happened. So I took a leave of absence pretty quickly from when, it'd been like, I don't know, a week and a half when my dad and my sister were hospitalized as well. I had taken a leave of absence. January 3rd actually was my last shift I had taken before I went on a leave of absence. Mm-hmm. And so there were just other people that I had worked with. There were directors of mine and coworkers that were floating down there. And one of them, she tells me every time she sees me, she said, "I want you to know that I would go in there and talk to your sister, and I would pray for her, and I would tell her to keep fighting." And she's like, and I would just sit there with her. And just all those moments of kindness, it meant so much to me to know that I knew these people, I had these people in my life. I had to switch jobs a little over a year ago because it got to be too much. And what I miss the most from leaving the hospital are my friends, my coworkers, because they were truly a support system for me. And that's what I miss the most from being there. But it was something I needed to do so that I could heal.
Yeah.
In September, this last September, I went on a 2-week vacation to Portugal with my ex-husband and my son. And it was amazing. I had such a great time. And when I came back, I just felt like I was a different person. I didn't feel that weight of the grief on me like I had before then. And there wasn't any great epiphany or any near-death experience or anything in particular that had an impact on me. I just felt like I finally accepted that they were gone. And it's a funny thing how acceptance can make you feel, because before I would dread any mention of them. I would dread the 10th, the 13th, the 26th. I would dread it. And now I accept it. I accept that they're gone. I accept that I'm going to have bad days. I'm going to have hard days. I'm going to have emotional days. Days where I see something and I want to call my sister or text her. Or when football starts and I want to talk to my dad about football. Or going to my brother's barbecue competitions. You know, things like that that I can't do anymore. I accept that. I accept that those days are going to be hard. My brother David has moved forward and started competing in barbecue competitions and representing my brother and his, you know, his logo, his team, and things like that. And so I know my brother would be happy for him that he was doing a good job. But it's sad for me to know that he had finally found a passion and that he's no longer here to live it, to keep doing it.
So, how is your mom doing?
I feel like she's always, you know, like that grief is just wearing her down, and that scares me. You know, she has, you know, grief in general just is hard on the physically hard on your body. And so she's, you know, dealing with a lot of things. And some days she has distractions because she will watch my niece and nephew while my brother works. And other days she'll text me and have, you know, having a hard day, and I'll text her and we'll kind of talk and everything. And it just is, it just is a process. It's a day by day thing. And you think you're going to be okay, and then something reminds you. She says that she feels my dad around her. She says sometimes she thinks she hears his voice, or that she sees my brother coming down the hallway, or, you know, my sister's laugh. And so she's trying to move on the best that she can. And I think just like all of us, she has those days where she can't. I told my ex-husband one time that I didn't want to burden my mom with my grief, because I didn't have the right to do that, because she lost her husband, the love of her life. She lost two of her children. And to me, her grief is so much more than my grief. And I didn't want to burden her with that, because I wanted her to be able to work through her own grief. And he just said, he asked me, he goes, are you saying that your grief isn't as important as your mom's? I said, yeah, that's exactly what I'm saying. I know now that that's not the right way to think that. Everybody has their own grief and everything. And so all I can do is be there for my mom and help her medically and be her advocate and just kind of help her. I feel like I'm in a better place to be able to do that.
Yeah. That's good. Have you submitted your family members' names to any memorial?
I have. It's funny, the first thing that I did was I was on Facebook. I was in a COVID loss group, and I came across this
post from somebody in England, in the UK, called the Enchanted Tea Room. And she had lost a family member to COVID and was putting yellow hearts in the window of the tea room, of the Enchanted Tea Room. So I messaged her and I asked her if it was just local or if she would accept names from anywhere. And I, told my story and stuff. And she added my dad, my sister, my brother's name to her windows, I should say. And I thought that was the coolest thing. I sent my mom a picture because she sent me a picture. And then Rosie came with the Yellow Heart Memorial. And I thought that was the coolest thing. And I had submitted their names. And I had gone to a couple of the memorials in California, here in California. I went to the one they had in Long Beach that Rosie helped Nancy Gonzalez put together. And that was so emotional to actually see their names on the yellow hearts and hear people's stories. I remember one woman, she lost her teenage son. He had developed a rare complication from COVID that COVID actually caused, and he passed away. And he was her only child. And I just felt so devastated for her.
Yeah.
They also did the flags in DC.
Mm-hmm.
They were signed up there. Rami's Heart. Their names are in heart number 6, I believe. Yeah. And Rima's been, great. And then they, also in Indiana, at, oh, God, I can't remember the name of the place, but in the library, their names, are there also. I know that they have, I'm not sure if it was Yellow Heart Memorial, but there's an actual, I guess, it's either them or Rami's Heart, where have historically, have the list of names of the loved ones that passed away to COVID. And even Hannah, Faces for COVID, drew a picture of my family members, and it's all 3 of them in the photo, in the drawing. And it came out so nice. She did such a great job. And I just really want them to be represented, because they're not just numbers, they're not statistics. These were people that were loved and that they're missed a lot. And I just don't want them to be forgotten.
Yeah. I think that's one of the hardest parts for me is that they just become numbers to a lot of people.
Yeah.
And I just want to shake people. Like, they're not numbers.
Yeah.
Yeah.
They're not. It's hard for me when people say, well, it's only 1% or only less than 1%. And I tell them, I said, you wouldn't be saying only if that was your mom or your dad, your husband, your wife, or your child. You wouldn't say, it's only 1% of the population. And that's hard for me when people say stuff like that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that brings me to the last question that I ask everybody who's on the show is, what do you say to people who tell you that COVID isn't real?
Sometimes I just have to bite my tongue. I've only ever really, like, someone directly to my face say, um, like, shocked, like, oh my God, this is actually real. And I just couldn't even, I just couldn't even say anything because I knew that if I said something, I would, it wouldn't be nice. And that is not my nature, to be mean to people. And um, it just is hard to respond to those. Sometimes I'll just quietly say, well, I lost my dad, my sister, and my brother to COVID, so to me it's real. And people just kind of like, oh, I'm so sorry, I didn't, I'm sorry, and I I have a friend I went to school with who was very against the COVID vaccine and everything. And I found out while I was still at the hospital that he was on a ventilator with COVID, and he recovered. And I check in with him from now and then and see how he's doing, how his recovery's doing, and wondering if he's having any long hauler symptoms, things like that. And I asked him, I said, now, having gone through what you have just gone through, what are your thoughts on the COVID vaccine? And he said that he said he's going to get it. He's going to get vaccinated. And it's sad that it takes something like that for people to realize that this is real.
Mm-hmm.
This is real, and you just don't know. The deaths of my family members changed a lot of people's minds on getting the COVID vaccine. And people that were on the fence and were like, no, I'm going to wait, got vaccinated as soon as they could. I mean, there were people like trying to figure out how to get around the guidelines so they could get vaccinated sooner rather than later. And, when I try and tell people, because people still believe that if they get the vaccine that they won't get COVID. And I still try and educate people and be like, in an ideal situation, yeah, the vaccine's going to keep you from getting COVID. But the purpose of the vaccine is to help you that if you do get COVID, that you don't get a severe case of COVID. And that's what I'm always doing, is I'm always educating, trying to educate people. It's what I do. It's what nurses do, is try and educate people. And there's still some people out there that have still refuse to get vaccinated, that still believe that COVID isn't real. I had a coworker at the hospital tell me to my face that, well, I've had the flu worse than I had COVID. And things like that. You just kind of have to bite your tongue and know that they're not. Just to hear that from somebody who is a nurse, somebody who's educated and believing that, it's hard. It doesn't even, the words just don't even come out of my mouth because I just can't. Yeah, I just can't. When I came back from Portugal, I had COVID,
again. And I was afraid to tell my mom because I didn't want her to worry.
Yeah.
And it, it kind of kicked my butt, and it was a shorter period from when I tested positive to when I tested negative. But I had lasting symptoms for a good probably 7 to 8 weeks. And, but I think some of it too was a few days after I'd gone back to work from having COVID, I got my flu vaccine. And then a couple of days after that, I got my COVID booster, my updated booster. So I think that since my immune system was already low from being sick, I think it just kind of had my body was like, what the heck? But I'm fully vaccinated and I'm glad. I think that everybody should at least get vaccinated with the first two. My niece, my sister's daughter, she barely in the last, I believe, year, um, got her COVID vaccine. And that's funny to me because it's like, how can you go through what we just went through and not do everything to protect yourself? But, everybody has a choice. Everybody has the decision to make for themselves. And you just have to hope that it's the right decision.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So your sister's name was Margie?
Yes.
And your brother's name was Raul?
Yes. So my dad was Raul Sr. and my brother was Raul Jr. My dad, he went by Rudy. So a lot of people knew him as Rudy. And then my brother, we would call him Junior. And so it's weird because people know him as Raul. So when I'm talking about him, I say Junior. I said, well, my brother Raul, and so, but yeah, they were amazing people. And even if nobody else in the world knew who they were amazing to us. I bought my mom a tree. My brothers and I bought my mom a tree to plant so that she has a place to sit. And at the cemetery, before the markers go in, they have these bricks with the names on them. And so when they took the bricks out to put the marker in, I asked the guy at the cemetery if I could have the bricks, and he allowed me to keep them.
Oh, wow.
And it was funny because they only had my dad's name and my brother's name on the bricks and not my sister's. And so when I would go to the cemetery, I had a pink Sharpie and I would always write my sister's name on it, on the brick with my brother. So when we got the tree for my mom, I got the bricks and I went over their names and then I sealed them with some resin. So the bricks are there with the tree. And it's kind of almost like a piece of them is there. So as the tree gets bigger, we can put a bench out there for my mom.
Yeah.
To kind of sit there and be there with them and stuff.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's beautiful. Well, thank you so much, Christina, for telling their story today and spending so much time talking about it.
Thank you for allowing me to talk. I haven't really told their story in a while.
Yeah.
So it's interesting to tell it when you feel a different way.
Yeah, like since your trip to Portugal and coming back and feeling that acceptance.
Yes.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Wow. Well, thank you.
Thank you, Jennifer. I appreciate it. I appreciate your podcast and knowing that we're not alone.
Yeah.
Nobody will ever truly understand what this experience has felt like if you haven't gone through it.
Yeah.
I thank you a lot for having this platform. I'm sorry for your loss of your mother.
Thank you.
And that you weren't, you know, I empathize with everybody that wasn't able to be there in those moments, or got the phone call or had to do iPad.
Mm-hmm.
You know, empathize with all of that because I can't imagine ever having to do that, go through that.
Yeah, it's like what you said about it being haunting for you. I'm haunted in the reverse of just wondering what it was like for my mom at the very end by herself.
Yeah. It's those memories, seeing them, that's the memory I have of them. And it's like those bad memories overshadow the good ones. And it's just now recently that that the good ones are starting to come through. But it doesn't make the bad ones go away because they're still there. It just I'm opening up more and the good ones are starting to come through.
Yeah. I guess that's part of the healing and just moving into grief. Yeah.
Yeah.
I feel that too. I feel like I look at pictures of my mom when she was happy and when we were smiling and having good times. And I try really hard to, when I watch videos, which are still very hard for me to watch videos where she's much more happy rather than in her Alzheimer's where she wasn't. So,
yeah.
And try to just focus on her life before all of that.
Yeah.
Well, thank you.
Thank you, Jennifer. I can't thank you enough.
And that's the show, everyone. This show won't ever have a members area or episodes that you have to pay to listen to, but there are expenses to hosting a podcast, and if you'd like to help, you can support this show at buymeacoffee.com/forthosewelost. The link is in the notes below. And if you're still listening, thank you so much if you are. If you like this episode, please share it on your social media. And if you can, please rate and review this podcast, especially on Apple Podcasts, because that's where most of our new listeners come from. So please share the show. Until next time.